nuhah, joksosos, hies elgar, fe aistudok, ugas, oskrod, aistei, abelia, joksosos, nuga aya, zro.
Welcome to the 269th of the Cthulhu podcasts. I'm Felbrick. Today we'll be starting up with part 1 of chapter 3 of Sir Ernest Shackleton's book South, and then we'll follow up with the next part of the dark and horrifying future of mankind in The Nightland. Let's go south. Chapter 3. Winter Months. The month of March opened with a severe northeasterly gale. 5 Weddels and 2 crab-eaters were shot on the floe during the morning of March the 1st, and the wind, with fine drifting snow, sprang up while the carcasses were being brought in by the sledging parties. The men were compelled to abandon some of the blubber and the meat, and they had a struggle to get back to the ship over the rough ice in the teeth of the storm. This gale continued until the 3rd, and all hands were employed in clearing out 'tween decks, which was to be converted into a living and dining room for officers and scientists. The carpenter erected in this room the stove that had been intended for use in the shore hut, and the quarters were made very snug. The dogs appeared indifferent to the blizzard. They emerged occasionally from the drift to shake themselves and to bark, but were content most of the time to lie curled into tight balls under the snow. One of the old dogs, Saint, died on the night of the 2nd, and the doctors reported that the cause of death was appendicitis. When the gale cleared, we found that the pack had been driven in from the northeast and was now more firmly consolidated than before. A new berg, probably 15 miles in length, had appeared on the northern horizon. The bergs within our circle of vision had all become familiar objects, and we had names for some of them. Apparently, they were all drifting with the pack. The sighting of a new berg was more than of passing interest, since in that comparatively shallow sea it would be possible for a big berg to become stranded. Then the island of ice would be a centre of tremendous pressure and disturbance amid the drifting pack. We'd seen something already of the smashing effect of a contest between berg and floe, and had no wish to have the helpless Endurance involved in such a battle of giants. During the 3rd, the seal meat and blubber was re-stowed on hammocks around the ship. The frozen masses had been sinking into the floe. Ice, though hard and solid to the touch, is never firm against heavy weights. An article left on the floe for any length of time is likely to sink into the surface ice. Then the salt water will percolate through the article and will become frozen into the body of the floe. Clear weather followed the gale, and we had a series of mock suns and perhelia. Minus temperatures were the rule, 21 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit being recorded on the 6th. We'd made mattresses for the dogs by stuffing sacks with straw and rubbish, and most of the animals were glad to receive this furnishing in their kennels. Some of them had suffered through the snow melting with the heat of their bodies and then freezing solid. The scientific members of the expedition were all busy by this time. The meteorologist had got his recording station, containing anemometer, barometer and thermometer, rigged over the stern. The geologist was making the best of what to him was an unhappy situation, but was not altogether without material. The pebbles found in the penguins were often of considerable interest, and some fragments of rock were being brought up from the sea floor with the sounding lead and the dragnet. On the 7th, Wordie and Worsley found some pebbles, a piece of moss and a perfect bivalve shell, and some dust that was found on a fragment of berg, and they brought their treasure trove proudly to the ship. Clark was using the dragnet frequently in the leads and secured good hauls of plankton, with occasional specimens of greater scientific interest. Seals were not plentiful, but our store of meat and blubber grew gradually. All hands ate seal meat with relish and would not have cared to become dependent on the ship's tinned meat. We preferred the crab-eater to the Weddell, which is a very sluggish beast. The crab-eater seemed cleaner and healthier. The killer whales were still with us. On the 8th we examined a spot where the floe ice had been smashed up by a blow from beneath, delivered presumably by a large whale in search of a breathing place. The force that exercised this was astonishing. Slabs of ice 3 feet thick and weighing tons had been tented upwards over a circular area with a diameter of about 25 feet, and cracks radiated outwards for more than 20 feet. The quarters in the 'tween decks were completed by the 10th, and the men took possession of the cubicles that had been built. The largest cubicle, containing Macklin, McIlroy, Hurley and Hussey, and it was named the Billabong. Clark and Wordy lived opposite in a room called Auld Reekie. Next came the abode of the Nuts, or engineers, followed by the Sailors' Rest, inhabited by Cheetham and McNeish. The anchorage and the fumarole were on the other side. The quarters became known as the Ritz. The meals were served there instead of in the wardroom. Breakfast was at 9 a.m., lunch at 1 p.m., and tea at 4 p.m., and dinner at 6 p.m. Wilde, Marston, Crean, Worsley established themselves in cubicles in the wardroom, and by the middle of the month all hands had settled down to the winter routine. I lived alone aft. Worsley, Hurley and Wordy made a journey to a big berg called by us the Rampart Berg on the 11th. The distance out was 7 miles, and the party covered a total distance of about 17 miles. Hurley took some photographs, and Wordy came back rejoicing with a little dust and some moss. Within a radius of 1 mile round the berg there is thin young ice, strong enough to march over with care, wrote Worsley. The area of dangerous pressure as regards a ship does not seem to extend far more than 1/4 of a mile from the berg. Here there are cracks and constant slight movement, which becomes exciting to the traveller when he feels a piece of ice gradually upending beneath his feet. Close to the berg, the pressure makes all sorts of quaint noises. We heard tapping as from a hammer, grunts, groans and squeaks, electric trams running, birds singing, kettles boiling noisily, and an occasional swish as a large piece of ice released from pressure suddenly jumped or turned over. We noticed all sorts of quaint effects, such as huge bubbles or domes of ice 40 feet across and 4 to 5 feet high. Large, sinuous pancake sheets were spread over the floe in places, and in one spot we counted 5 such sheets, each about 2 inches thick, imbricated one under the other. They look as though they've been made of barley sugar and are very slippery. The noon position on the 14th was latitude 76 degrees 54 minutes south, longitude 36 degrees 10 minutes west. The land was visible faintly to the southeast, distant about 36 miles. A few small leads could be seen from the ship, but the ice was firm in our neighbourhood. The drift of the Endurance was still towards the northwest. I had the boilers blown down on the 15th, and the consumption of 2 quarter of coal per day to keep the boilers from freezing then ceased. The bunkers still contained 52 tons of coal, and the daily consumption in the stoves was about 200 weight. There would not be much coal left for steaming purposes in the spring, but I anticipated eking out the supply with blubber. A moderate gale from the northeast on the 17th brought a fine penetrating snow. The weather cleared in the evening, and a beautiful crimson sunset held our eyes. At the same time, the ice cliffs of the land were thrown up in the sky by mirage, and with an apparent reflection in the open water, though the land itself could not be seen definitely. The effect was repeated in an exaggerated form on the following day, when the ice cliffs were thrown up above the horizon in double and treble parallel lines, some inverted. The mirage was due probably to lanes of open water near the land. The water would be about 30 degrees warmer than the air, and would cause warmed strata to ascend. A sounding gave 606 fathoms, with a bottom of glacial mud. 6 days later, on the 24th, the depth was 419 fathoms. We were drifting steadily, and the constant movement, coupled with the appearance of lanes near the land, convinced me that we must stay by the ship until she got clear. I had considered the possibility of making a landing across the ice in the spring, but the hazards of such an undertaking would be too great. The training of the dogs in sledge teams was making progress. The orders used by the drivers were mush to go on, G to go right, haw to go left, and whoa to stop. These are the words that the Canadian drivers long ago adopted, borrowing them originally from England. There were many fights at first, until the dogs learned their positions and their duties. But as days passed, drivers and teams became efficient. Each team had its leader, and efficiency depended largely on the willingness and ability of this dog to punish skulking and disobedience. We learned not to interfere unless the disciplinary measures threatened to have a fatal termination. The drivers could sit on the sledge and jog along at ease if they chose, but the prevailing minus temperatures made riding unpopular, and the men preferred usually to run or to walk alongside the teams. We were still losing dogs through sickness, due to stomach and intestinal worms. Dredging for specimens at various depths was one of the duties during these days. The dredge and several hundred fathoms of wire line made a heavy load, far beyond the unaided strength of the scientists. On the 23rd, for example, we put down a 2-foot dredge and 650 fathoms of wire. The dredge was hove in 4 hours later and brought much glacial mud, several pebbles and rock fragments, 3 sponges, some worms, brachiopods and foraminiferae. The mud was troublesome. It was heavy to lift, and as it froze rapidly when brought to the surface, the recovery of the specimens embedded in it was difficult. A haul made on the 26th brought a prize for the geologist in a form of lump of sandstone weighing 75 pounds, a piece of fossiliferous limestone, a fragment of striated shale, sandstone grit, and some pebbles. Hauling in the dredge by hand was severe work, and on the 24th we used the Girling tractor motor, which brought in 500 fathoms of line in 30 minutes, including stops. One stop was due to water having run over the friction gear and frozen. It was a day or two later that we heard a great yell from the floe, and found Clark dancing about and shouting Scottish war cries. It secured his first specimen of an Antarctic fish, apparently a new species. Mirages were frequent. Barrier cliffs appeared all around us on the 29th, even in places where we knew there was deep water. Bergs and pack are thrown into the sky and distorted into the most fantastic shapes. They climb, trembling upwards, spreading out into long lines at different levels, and then contract and fall down, leaving nothing but an uncertain, wavering smudge which comes and goes. Presently the smudge swells and grows, taking shape until it presents the perfectly inverted reflection of a berg on the horizon. In effect, the shadow hovering over the substance. More smudges appear at different points on the horizon. These spread out into long lines until they meet, and we're girded by lines of shining snow cliffs, laved at their bases by waters of illusion in which they appear to be faithfully reflected. So the shadows come and go silently, melting away finally as the sun declines to the west. We seem to be drifting helplessly in a strange world of unreality. It is reassuring to feel the ship beneath one's feet, and to look down at the familiar line of kennels and igloos on the solid floe. The floe was not so solid as it appeared. We had reminders occasionally that the greedy sea was very close, and that the floe was but a treacherous friend, which might open suddenly beneath us. Towards the end of the month I had our store of seal meat and blubber brought aboard. The depth, as recorded by a sounding on the last day of March, was 256 fathoms. The continuous shoaling from 606 fathoms in a drift of 39 miles north, 26 degrees west, in 30 days was interesting. The sea shoaled as it went north, either to the east or to the west, and the facts suggested that the contour lines ran east-west roughly. Our total drift between January the 19th, when the ship was frozen in, and March 31st, a period of 71 days, had been 95 miles in a north 80 degrees west direction. The icebergs around us had not changed their relative positions. The sun sank lower in the sky. The temperatures became lower, and the Endurance felt the grip of the icy hand of winter. 2 northeasterly gales in the early part of April assisted to consolidate the pack. The young ice was thickening rapidly. Although leads were visible occasionally from the ship, no opening of a considerable size appeared in our neighbourhood. In the early morning of April the 1st, we listened again for the wireless signals from Port Stanley. The crew had lashed 3 20-foot rickers to the mastheads in order to increase the spread of our aerials, but still we failed to hear anything. The rickers had to come down subsequently, since we found that the gear could not carry to the accumulating weight of rime. Soundings proved the sea continued to shoal as the Endurance drifted to the northwest. The depth on April the 2nd was 262 fathoms, with a bottom of glacial mud. 4 weeks later, a sounding gave 172 fathoms. The presence of grit in the bottom samples towards the end of the month suggested that we were approaching land again. The month itself was uneventful. During the night of the 3rd, we heard the ice grinding to the eastward, and in the morning we saw that young ice was rafted 8 to 10 feet high in places. This was the first murmur of the danger that was to reach menacing proportions in later months. The ice was heard grinding and creaking during the 4th, and the ship vibrated slightly. The movement of the floe was sufficiently pronounced to interfere with the magnetic work. I gave orders that the accumulations of snow, ice, and rubbish along the side of the Endurance should be shovelled away, so that in case of pressure there would be no weight against the topsides to check the ship rising above the ice. All hands were busy with pick and shovel during the day, and moved many tons of material. Again, on the 9th, there were signs of pressure. Young ice was piled up to a height of 11 feet astern of the ship, and the old floe was cracked in places. The movement was not serious, but I realized that it might be the beginning of trouble for the expedition. We brought certain stores aboard and provided space on the deck for the dogs, in case they had to be removed from the floe at short notice. We had a run of 500 fathom steel wire around the ship, snow huts and kennels with a loop out to the lead ahead, where the dredge was used. This wire was supported on ice pillars, and it served as a guide in bad weather when the view was obscured by driving snow and a man might have lost himself altogether. I had this wire cut in 5 places, since otherwise it might have been dragged across our section of the floe with damaging effect in the event of ice splitting suddenly. The dogs had been divided into 6 teams of 9 dogs each. Wild, Crean, Macklin, McIlroy, Marsden, and Hurley each had charge of a team, and were fully responsible for the exercising, training, and feeding of their own dogs. They called in one of the surgeons when an animal was sick. We were still losing some dogs through worms, and it was unfortunate that the doctors had not the proper remedies. Worm powders were to have been provided by the expert Canadian dog driver that I had engaged before sailing for the south, and when this man did not join the expedition, the matter was overlooked. We had 54 dogs and 8 pups early in April, but several were ailing, and the number of mature dogs was reduced to 50 by the end of the month. Our store of seal meat amounted now to about 5,000 pounds, and I calculated that we had enough meat and blubber to feed the dogs for 90 days without trenching upon the sledging rations. The teams were working well, often with heavy loads. The biggest dog was Hercules, who tipped the beam at 86 pounds. Samson was 11 pounds lighter, but he justified his name one day by starting off at a smart pace with a sledge carrying 200 pounds of blubber and a driver. A new berg that was going to give us some cause for anxiety made its appearance on the 14th. It was a big berg, and we noticed it as it lay on the northwest horizon that it had a hummocky and crevassed appearance at the east end. During the day, this berg increased its apparent altitude and changed its bearing slightly. Evidently, it was aground and was holding its position against the drifting pack. A sounding at 11 a.m. gave 197 fathoms, with a hard, stony or rocky bottom. During the next 24 hours, the Endurance moved steadily towards the crevassed berg, which doubled its altitude in that time. We could see from the masthead that the pack was piling and rafting against the mass of ice, and it was easy to imagine what would be the fate of the ship if she entered the area of disturbance. She'd be crushed, like an eggshell amidst the shattering masses. Worsley was in the crow's nest on the evening of the 15th, watching for signs of land to the westward, and he reported an interesting phenomenon. The sun set amid a glow of prismatic colours on a line of clouds just above the horizon. A minute later, Worsley saw a golden glow which expanded as he watched, and presently the sun appeared again and rose a semi-diameter clear above the horizon. He hailed Crean, who from a position on the floe 90 feet below the crow's nest also saw the reborn sun. A quarter of an hour later, from the deck, Worsley saw the sun set a second time. This strange phenomenon was due to mirage or refraction. We attributed this to an ice crack to the westward, where the band of open water had heated a stratum of air. The drift of the pack was not constant, and during the succeeding days the crevassed berg alternately advanced and receded as the Endurance moved with the flow. On Sunday, April the 18th, it was only 7 miles distant from the ship. It is a large berg, about 3/4 of a mile long on the side presented to us, and probably well over 200 feet high. It is heavily crevassed as though it once formed a serac position of a glacier. Two specifically wide and deep chasms across it from the southeast and northwest give it the appearance of having broken its back on the shoal ground. Huge masses of pressure ice are piled against its cliffs to a height of about 60 feet, showing the stupendous force that's being brought to bear upon it by the drifting pack. The berg must be very firmly aground. We swing the arrow on the current meter frequently and watch with keen attention to see where it will come to rest. Will it point straight for the berg, showing that our drift is in that direction? It swings round slowly. It points to the northeast end of the berg, and then shifts slowly to the centre and seems to stop, but it moves again and swings 20 degrees clear of our enemy to the southwest. We notice that two familiar bergs, the Rampart Berg and the Peak Berg, have moved away from the ship. Probably they also have grounded or dragged on the shoal. A strong drift to westward during the night of the 18th relieved our anxiety by carrying the Endurance to the lee of the crevassed berg, which passed out of our range of vision before the end of the month. We said goodbye to the sun on May the 1st, and entered the period of twilight that would be followed by the darkness of midwinter. The sun, by the aid of refraction, still cleared the horizon at noon and set shortly before 2 p.m. A fine aurora in the evening was dimmed by the full moon, which had risen on April the 27th, and would not set again until May the 6th. The disappearance of the sun is apt to be a depressing event in the polar regions, where the long months of darkness involve mental as well as physical strain. But the Endurance's company refused to abandon their customary cheerfulness, and a concert in the evening made a Ritz a scene of noisy merriment in strange contrast with the cold, silent world that lay outside. One feels our helplessness as the long winter closes upon us. By this time, if fortune had smiled upon the expedition, we would have been comfortably and securely established in a shore base, with depots laid to the south and plans made for the long march in the spring and summer. Where will we make a landing now? It's not easy to forecast the future. The ice may open in the spring, but by that time we will be far to the northwest. I do not think we shall be able to work back to Vachel Bay. There are possible landing places on the western coast of the Weddell Sea, but can we reach any suitable spot early enough to attempt the overland journey next year? Time alone will tell. I do not think any member of the expedition is disheartened by our disappointment. All hands are cheery and busy and will do their best when the time for action comes. In the meantime, we must wait. The ship's position on Sunday, May the 2nd, was latitude 75 degrees 23 minutes south, longitude 42 degrees 14 minutes west. The temperature at noon was 5 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and the sky was overcast. A seal was sighted from the masthead at lunchtime, and 5 men with 2 dog teams set off after the prize. They had an uncomfortable journey outward in the dim diffused light which cast no shadows and gave no warning of irregularities on the white surface. It is a strange sensation to be running along on apparently smooth snow and to fall suddenly into an unseen hollow or to bump against a ridge. After going out 3 miles to the westward, wrote Worsley in describing this seal hunt, we range up and down but find nothing, until from a hummock I fancy I see something apparently a mile away, but probably little more than half that distance. I ran for it, found the seal, and with a shout brought up the others at the double. The seal was a big Weddell, over 10 feet long, and weighing more than 800 pounds. But Soldier, one of the team leaders, went for its throat without a moment's hesitation, and we had to beat off the dogs before we could shoot the seal. We caught 5 or 6 gallons of blood in a tin for the dogs, and let the teams have a drink of fresh blood from the seal. The light was worse than ever on our return, and we arrived back in the dark. Sir Ernest met us with a lantern and guided us into the lead astern and thence to the ship. This was our first seal we'd secured since March the 19th, and the meat and blubber made a welcome addition to the stores. 3 emperor penguins made their appearance in a lead west of the ship on May the 3rd. They pushed their heads through the young ice while 2 of the men were standing by the lead. The men imitated the emperor's call and walked slowly, penguin fashion, away from the lead. The birds in succession made a magnificent leap 3 feet clear of the water onto the young ice, and thence they tobogganed to the bank and followed the men away from the lead. Their retreat was soon cut off by a line of men. We walk up to them, talking loudly and assuming a threatening aspect. Notwithstanding our bad manners, the 3 birds turn towards us, bowing ceremoniously. Then, after a closer inspection, they conclude that we are undesirable acquaintances, and make off across the floe. We head them off and finally shepherd them close to the ship, where the frenzied barking of the dog so frightens them that they make a determined effort to break through the line. We seize them. One bird of philosophic mien goes quietly, led by one flipper. The others show fight, but all are imprisoned in an igloo for the night. In the afternoon we see 5 emperors in the western lead and capture 1. Kerr and Cheetham fight a valiant action with 2 large birds. Kerr rushes at one, seizes it, and is promptly knocked down by the angered penguin, which jumps on his chest before retiring. Cheetham comes up to Kerr's assistance, and between them they seize another penguin, bind his bill, and lead him muttering muffled protests to the ship like an inebriated old man between 2 policemen. He weighs 85 pounds, or 5 pounds less than the heaviest emperor captured previously. Kerr and Cheetham insist that he is nothing to the big fellow who escaped them. The penguin's stomach proved to be filled with freshly caught fish up to 10 inches long. Some of the fish were of coastal or littoral variety. 2 more emperors were captured on the following day, and while Wordy was leading one of them towards the ship, Wild came along with his team. The dogs, uncontrollable in a moment, made a frantic rush for the bird, and they were almost upon him when the harness caught upon an ice pylon, which they tried to pass on both sides of at once. The result was a seething tangle of dogs, traces of men, and an overturned sled, while the penguin, 3 yards away, nonchalantly, indifferently, surveyed the disturbance. He had never seen anything of the kind before, and had no idea at all that the strange disorder might concern him. Several cracks had opened in the neighbourhood of the ship, and the emperor penguins, fat and glossy of plumage, were appearing in considerable numbers. We secured 9 of them on May the 6th, an important addition to our supply of fresh food. Now it's time to return to the horrors of the Nightland, with part 1 of Chapter 6. Chapter 6. The Way That I Did Go. Now I went forward a space, and took heed not to look backwards, but to be strong of heart and spirit. For that which did lie before me had need of all my manhood and courage of soul, that I should come to the succour of that maid afar in the darkness of the world, or to meet my death proper, as it might need to be. And thus I did go forward steadfastly, and conscious in all my being of the emotions of that parting from my mighty home, and of the tenderness and wiseness that did underlie so much curbed rule and guidance. And my heart was warm towards the Master Monstrawakan, for that great honour, that he should come downward in armour to make one the full watch, that he might uphold me to a lofty spirit at that moment of my going. And all that time, as I went forward, was the ether of the night about me in tumult with the thoughts and blind wishes of the great millions I had but now left to my back. And presently, as I steadied somewhat upon my emotions, I was conscious of the exceeding coldness of the night air, and of the different taste of it upon my lungs and in my mouth, and it had, as it were, a wondrous keen sharping upon my palate, and did fill my lips more in the breathing, so that it may be supposed it had more body within it than that air which did fill the plateau of the 1000th city, where was my home. For the air of every city was of difference, and the greater between one that was afar up and another nigh to the earth, as may be thought, so that many peoples did migrate unto that level which gave them best healthfulness, but under rule and with guidance of quantities, and not all that were lacking of health, for some are ever contrary. And here let me set down that within the deeps of the fields their air utter varied and wonderful, that might charm one here, and likewise sorrow another that were happier elsewhere, so that all might have suiting, but they but wander, and the reason to companion them. And thus did I go forward, full of new thoughts of older memories and fresh breaking wonders, neither forgetting something of doubts and fears more than a little, but again was it most cunning strange to be out there in the nightland, though not yet afar, where often had my fancies and imaginings led me. Yet until that time never had I touched foot in all that life upon the outward earth, and this must be a wondrous quaint seeming thought to those of this present day. And so came I, at last, nigh to the circle that did about the redoubt, and presently I was come to it. And something astonished was I that it had no great bigness, for I had looked for this by reasoning, having always a mind to picture things as they might be truly, and hence coming sometimes to the wonder of a great truth, but odd whiles to errors that others had not made. And now, lo, I did find it but a small clear tube that had not 2 inches of thickness, yet sent out a very bright and strong light, so that it seemed greater to the eye did one but behold from a distance. And this is but a little thing to set to the telling, yet may it give something of the newness of all, and moreover, shall you have memories with me in this place, how that oft I had seen things and beast monsters peer over that same little tube of light, their faces coming forward out of the night. And this I had seen as child and man, for as children we did use keep often a watch by hours upon a holiday time through the great glasses of the embrasures, and we did always hope each to be that one that might first discover a monster looking inwards upon the mighty pyramid, across the shining of the circle, and these to come oft yet presently to slink away into the night, having in verity no liking for that light. And pride had we taken of ourselves to perceive these monsters, which had most of the ugliness and horror to commend them, for thereby did we stand to have won the game of watching, until such time as a more fearsome brute be discovered. And so went the play, yet with ever it doth seem to me now something of a half-known shudder to the heart, and a child's rejoicing unknowingly in that safety which had power to make light the seeming of such matters. And this also is but a small matter, yet doth it bear upon the inwardness of my feelings. For the memories of all my youth and of many beasts that I had seen to peer across the light did come upwards in my mind in that moment, so that I did give back a little unthinking of what I did, but having upon me the sudden imagining of that which might come out of the dark beyond. And I to stand a little moment, and presently had grown free in my heart to have courage of farewell, and so did turn me at last to the viewing of that wondrous home of the last millions of this world. And the sight was an astonishment and an uplifting, that indeed was so mighty a thing in all the earth. And well might be that there were monsters and forces gathered about that hill of life, out of all the darkness of the world. For a thing was as mighty as a mountain that went up measureless into the night, and spread out upon the earth to the right and to the left of me, so that it did seem to hold all the world within its might. And in the nearer slope there were 300,000 great embrasures, as well I did know, there being in all the 4 sides of the redoubt 1,200,000 embrasures, as was set out in the books of the schools, and upon the cover of the atlas books as they still quaintly to be called, and many another place, as might be supposed. And 1/2 mile upward was the lowest tier of those great window places, and above that countless other tiers, and a great light came out from them into the darkness, so that I looked into the night many miles, and yet did see them in shining rows, and did make separate each embrasure from its fellow for a great way. But there grew yet more above in the mighty distance, so that they were lost in the upward space of the night, and did seem to me presently but a constant glimmering fire, that did shape a shining peak into the blackness of the heavens, dwindling into the utmost height. And thus was that everlasting monument. Then did it come to me that those little things which I did see to cluster against the embrasures were in truth the countless millions of the mighty redoubt, and this I could make out with some plainness in the lower embrasures, which were more near to me than they above. For the peoples were set against the light within, yet were as small as things unto insects, in that distance and within so huge a bulk. And I knew that they looked out upon me, and did watch through their spy-glasses, and I sent my gaze upwards again along that great slope of grey metal, aye, upward again to where it strode glimmering into the blackness, and so at last to that little star that did crown that wonder of the world in the eternal night. And for a little I did stare towards that far light, for it came from within the tower of observation where so lately I had spended my life. And I had knowledge within my heart that the dear Master Monstruacan did bend the great spyglass upon me, through which so oft I had spied, and I raised the discos unto him in salutation and farewell, though I saw him not at all through that vast space. And my heart was very full, yet my soul but the stronger for it. And then, behold, I was aware of a murmur in the night coming to me, dim and from afar off, and I saw the little shapes of the peoples in the lower embrasures in constant movement. And I knew upon the instant that the multitudes did take that salute unto themselves, and cried out and waved to me their farewells, or to come back, as may be. And indeed I was but a loathsome person, looking at that great mountain of metal and life, and I knew that I had danger to realize my plight, and I stayed no more, but did raise the discourse reversed, as was but meet from one young man unto all the millions. And I looked swiftly upward through those 8 great miles of night, unto that final light which did shine in the black heavens, so that my friend should know that I thought of him that was beyond my sight in that last moment. And it may be that the invisible millions that were far up in the night in the upper cities did take that also to be a meaning of farewell to themselves, for there came down out of the monstrous height a far faint murmur of sound, as of vague wind up in the night. Then did I lower the discos and turn me about, and I breasted strangely against the air clog and stepped forward across the circle into that lonesomeness of the night land. And I looked no more behind, for that which was my home did weaken my heart somewhat to behold, so that I made determination that I look not again to my back for a great while. Yet about me, as I went, there was constant surging in the ether of the world, and it did tell unto me how that those, my people and kin, had continual mind of me, both in prayer and wishings, and in perpetual watching. And the same gave to me a feeling as of being something companied. Yet in a time it came to me that this disturbance of the ether should tell to some evil force how that I was abroad in the land. But how to stop this thing? Who should have power? For of truth, had I been among them to make a full explaining of the danger, they had yet been powerless to seize. For but to have the great multitudes a think upon one matter was to set a disturbance about, as should be most clear to all. Now, at the beginning, I did walk outwards into the nightland, somewhat blindly and without sure direction, being intent only to put a good space to my back, that I might cure somewhat the ache which did weaken my heart at the first. But in a while I ceased somewhat from my over-swiftness, and did put thought into my going, and I came quickly to reason that I should try a new way through the land, for it might be that there was an over-watchfulness in that part which had been trod by the youths. And I began therewith to set this thought to the practice, and went not direct towards the north, but to the north and west, and so in the end to mean to circle around to the back of the north-west watcher, and thence to the north of the plain of blue fire, and afterwards, as might be, have a true and straight way to the north, and by this planning come a long way clear of that house of silence, which did put more fear upon me than all else that was horrid in the land. Yet, as we will see, this made to me a greater journey, though in verity it were better to go slowly and to win success than to make a greater haste towards destruction, which was indeed surely to be mine end, did I not go warily. Now it may be thought upon with wonder that I did go so assuredly to the north, but I went this wise, part by an inward knowing, and part come upon by much latter thinking, within the pyramid of olden books, and by reasoning upon all things that I did observe, that had seemings of verity in them. And because of this constant searching upon one matter, I had come but a while back upon a little book of metal, very strange and ancient, that had lain forgot in a hid place in the great library through 100,000 years, maybe, or less or more, for all that I had knowing of. And much that was writ in the book was common knowledge, and set mostly to the count of fairy tales and such like, even as we of this our age take not overly surely any belief in myths of olden times. Yet had I always much liking for such matters, perceiving behind that outer shell which did win always so much unbelief, the kernel of ancient truths and happenings. And thus it was concerning this little book which I had made a discovery of, for it told again that which oft I had heard, even as we in this age read of the deluge, how that once in a time of monstrous far back from that, but utter future to this age of ours, the world did break upwards in a vast earthquaking, and did rend the world for 1,000 miles. And there came a mighty chasm, so deep that none might see the bottom thereof, and there rushed therein an ocean, and the earth did burst afresh with a sound that did shake all the cities of the world, and a great mist lay upon the earth for many days, and there was a mighty rain. And indeed, this was just so set in certain histories of the ancient world. Also, there was made reference to it within some olden records. Yet no ways to be taken for a serious mind to the seeming of the peoples of the mighty pyramid, but only as a quaint study for the students, and to be set out in little tales that did entertain the nurseries, or, as might be, wise men and the general. Yet there was about this small and peculiar book that it did speak of many of these things, as it were, that it did quote from the pens of those that did have actual witness, and set all out with a strange gravity, that did cause one to consider it as meant to be indeed the tellings of truth, and to seem this wise to have great difference from all that I had read before concerning those matters. And there was, further, a part in the ending of the book that did seem to be writ of a time that came afterwards, maybe 100,000 and maybe 1,000,000 years, but who shall say? And therein did it tell of a huge and mighty valley that did come out of the west towards the south-east, and made turnings thence northwards, and was 1,000 miles both ways, and the sides thereof were made 100 miles deep, and the sun did stand in the western end, and made a red gloom for 1,000 miles. And in the bottom there were great seas, and beasts strange and awesome and very plentiful. Now this, as may be seen, was the talk of romance, yet did I turn my wits to their natural end, and thus made plain of it. For in truth, to have something of belief, and to seem to me that in a bygone eternity, when the world was yet light, as in heart I knew to have been indeed a thing of verity, there was a great and wondrous earthquake. And the earthquake did burst upon the world along a certain great curve, where it had a weakness. And there fell into the yawning furnace of the world one of the great oceans, and immediately made of itself steam, and so brake upwards again, and tore the earth mightily in its swift uprising. And thereafter there was a mist of confusion and rain upon the world, and indeed all very seemly put, and not to be taken as a light tale. Then in the ending of that book there was one that did write, having lived a vast later age, when the sun had come anigh to its dying, and the upward earth was grown quiet and cold, and not good to live upon. And in that time the mighty chasm had calmed by the weight of eternity, so that it was now a most deep and wondrous valley, that did hold seas and great hills and mountains, and in it were great forests of kinds, and lands that were good and healthful, and places given over to fire and to steamings and sulphur clouds, so that they held poisons that had ill for man. And great beasts there were down in that far depth, that none might see ever save by a strong spyglass, and such there were in the early world, and had now been bred in the ending of those inward forces of nature which did make the valley a place of good warmth, so that there was, as it were, once more the primal world born to give new birth unto such olden monsters, and to others new and peculiar to that age and circumstance. And all this indeed did the book give also, but constrained and difficult to take clearly to heart, and must not like to the wise plain speech of the early tellings, so that I must even set it out here in mine own speech. And it did seem to me, by my reading, that man had come at one time to a great softness of heart and spirit through many ages of over-ease, but that the world did come to coldness and unfriendliness by reason of the sun's slow ceasing. And there was presently in naturalness a race born upon the earth that were hardy, and made to fight for their lives, and did perceive that the mighty valley that cut the world in twain was a place of warmth and life, and so did make adventure to their bodies down to that wondrous height, and were many ages coming safe to the bottom, but did find safe places in the downward way, where they built them houses, and made to live and begot them children, and these grew up to that life of constant and great climbings, and of hard workings upon the road which was the one intent of that people, so that the book did speak of them always as the road makers. And thus did they make downwards through the long years and ages, and many generations did live and die, and saw not the reaching of the road down into the great vale that lay so monstrously deep in the world. But in the end they did come there with the road, and they were very hardy, and they did fight with the monsters and slay many, and they built them many cities, through great years in that mighty valley, and did make the road from city unto city along the great valley, even unto the bight of the valley. And they found here a constant darkness and shadow, for that the sun could not make a shining round that great corner. Yet even here they ceased not to make the road, but took it around and a mighty way unto the north, passing it among strange fires and pits that burned out from the earth. But there was presently such a power and horror of monsters and evil things in that valley of shadow, that the road makers were made to go backwards into the red light which did fill the westward valley and came from that low sun. And they went back unto their cities, and lived there maybe 100,000 years, and grew wise and cunning in all matters. And their wise people did make dealings and had experiment with those forces which are distasteful and harmful unto life. But they did this in ignorance, for all that they had much wisdom, thinking only to experiment, that they come to a greater knowings. But they did open a way for those forces, and much harm and pity did there come by, and then had all the people yet to regret, yet too late. Now presently, when 100,000 years had gone, or it may be a greater space, there came slowly the utter twilight of the world, as the sun to die the more, so that presently it gave but an utter gloomy light, and there grew upon many of the peoples of the cities of that valley a strangeness and a wildness, so that strange things were done that had been shameful to all in the light, and there were wanderings and consortings with strange outward beings. And presently many cities were attacked by monsters that did come from the west, and there was a pandemonium. Then was an age of sorrows and fightings, and hardenings of the spirit and of the heart, for all that were of good fibre. And this did breed a determined generation. And there grew up into the world a leader, and he took all the sound millions, and did make a mighty battle upon the foulness and upon all that did harm and trouble them. And they drove their enemies down the valley, and up the valley, and did utterly scatter and put them to flight. Then did that man call all his peoples together, and did make it plain how that the darkness grew upon the world, and that the foul and dreadful powers abroad were like to be more horrid when a greater gloom came. And he put them that they might build a mighty refuge. And the peoples did acclaim, and lo, there was built presently a great house. But the great house was not proper, and that man did take all the peoples to wonder, and they came to the bight. And there was built at last that great and mighty pyramid. Now this is the sense and telling of that book. And but late I had read it, and talked somewhat of it with my dear friend the Master Monstruacan, but not overmuch, for I had so taken a sudden mind to go, and all else had dropped from about me. Yet to us it did seem clear that there was no life in all the invisible upper world, and that surely the great road whereon the silent ones did walk must be that same road which these hardy peoples of that age did make. And it did seem wise to the Master Monstruacan and unto me that if any should find the lesser redoubt, they must surely do so somewhere within the mighty valley. But whether the road that led into the west, where was the place of the abhumans, should bring me to it, I had no knowing, nor whether it might lie on the northward way, and I, maybe, to wander 1,000 miles wrong, if in truth I were not to some dreadful trouble before. And indeed no reason of value was there to give me hope that the lesser pyramid lay either to the west, or where the road to the northward beyond the House of Silence. Yet I did so feel it to be somewhere to the north, that I had made a determination to search that way for a great distance the first, and if I could not come upon aught, then I should have sober thought that it did lie westward. But in the valley someways I had feeling of assurance that it must be, for it was plain that the telling of the book was sound in its bottom sense, as might be seen. For how should any live in the utter bleak and deadly chill of the silent upper world that lay 100 miles up in the night, hid and lost for ever? And strange is it yet to think of those wondrous and mighty cliffs that girt us about, and yet were fast held from us in the dark, so that I had not known of them save for the telling of that book, though in truth it had been always supposed that we lived in a great deep of the world, but indeed it was rather held in belief that we abode in the bed of some ancient sea, that did surely slope gradually away from us, and not go up abrupt and savage. And here let me make so clear as I may, that the general peoples had no clear thought upon any such matters, though there was something of it taught in the schools, yet rather this and that of diverse conclusions, as it might be thinkings of the teachers, after much study and some ponderings. For one man, having a lack of imagining, would scoff, and another, maybe, to take it very stately. But some would build fancy upon the tellings of the records, and make foolish and fantastic that which had groundings in truth, and thus it is ever. But to the most peoples of the pyramid there was no deep conviction nor thought of any great hid world afar in the darkness, for they gave attention and belief only to that which lay to their view, nor could a great lot come to imagine that there had ever been any other condition. And to them it did seem right and meet that there should be strange things and fires from the earth, and an ever-abiding night, and monsters, and matters hid and tangled much in mystery. And very content were the most of them, though some had in them the yeast of imaginings, or the pimples of fancy upon them, and these there seemed many possibilities, though the first to read out to sanity, and the second to expect and to have speech towards much that was foolish or to no purpose. And of these vague believings of the peoples have I made hint before, and need not have much trouble to it now, save that with the children, as is ever the way, the olden tales had much believing, and the simplicity of the wise did mate with the beliefs of the young, and between them did lie the truth. And so did I make speed towards the north, having a strong surety in my heart and mind that there were but two ways to my search. For without the valley, afar up in the dead lonesomeness of the hidden world, was a cold that was shapen ready to death, and a lacking, as I must believe, of the sweet needful air that yet did lie in plenty in that deep place of the earth, so that surely the mighty valley somewheres to hold that other redoubt. Yet, as I have said, I went not direct to my journey, but otherwise, for those sound reasons which I did set down a time back. And that's all for today, except to remind you of my Patreon account, where you can support my production of audiobooks. As a Patreon, you'll get access not just to the stories published here in the podcast, but also all the other books I record. At the moment I'm recording Heart of Darkness, Volume 5 of A History of the Peninsular War, and a sci-fi book called Masters of Space, and I just dropped a complete spy story into the download folder for my patrons. Please go to patreon.com and search for Felbrigg, Felbrigg. This file is released on an attribution non-commercial no derivatives license. So, until next time.
CthulhuPodcast.co www.ecom.uk.